The date is August 19, 1981. The geographical setting is the central Mediterranean, specifically the body of water known as the Gulf of Sidra. To the casual observer looking at a map, this is simply a curvature in the coastline of North Africa. To the strategists in Washington, D.C. and the Revolutionary Command Council in Tripoli, however, this water is the stage for a collision between two incompatible visions of international order. The conflict did not begin on this morning. It began 8 years earlier in 1973 when Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, the erratic and ambitious leader of Libya, made a proclamation that defied centuries of maritime law. He drew a line across the mouth of the Gulf, roughly along the latitude 32 degrees 30 minutes north. He declared that the waters south of this line, an area of approximately 22,000 square miles, roughly the size of West Virginia, were no longer international waters. He named them the Gulf of Sidra and declared them to be integral sovereign territory of the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. He famously dubbed this demarcation the Line of Death. Gaddafi's declaration was a direct challenge to the United States. Since the earliest days of the Republic, American naval doctrine had been built on the foundation of freedom of navigation. The United States recognized a territorial limit of 3 nautical miles, later extended to 12, but absolutely refused to recognize the annexation of vast swathes of open ocean. If Gaddafi's claim were allowed to stand unchallenged, it would set a precedent that could close strategic waterways like the Strait of Hormuz or the South China Sea. For most of the 1970s, the response from Washington had been sporadic, but in January 1981, Ronald Reagan entered the White House. The new administration brought with it a more muscular, confrontational foreign policy. The directive from the Pentagon was clear: the United States Navy would not just sail near the line of death, they would cross it. They would conduct routine naval exercises inside the disputed waters to physically demonstrate that the claim was invalid. The instrument chosen for this demonstration was the USS Nimitz, CVN-68. The Nimitz was not just a ship, it was the lead vessel of a new class of nuclear-powered supercarriers, a floating projection of American industrial might displacing nearly 100,000 tons. It carried a crew of nearly 6,000 men and an air wing of 90 aircraft. It was a city of steel fueled by 2 nuclear reactors that allowed it to sail for 20 years without refueling. On the morning of August 19th, the Nimitz was conducting a missile exercise, Missilex, inside the Gulf. The roar on the flight deck was deafening. Steam catapults fired every few minutes, flinging 30-ton aircraft from a standstill to 170 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds. The smell of JP-5 jet fuel and burnt rubber hung heavy in the humid Mediterranean air. Among the aircraft launching were the F-14 Tomcats of Fighter Squadron 41 VF-41, the Black Aces. The pilots and radar intercept officers, RIOs, of VF-41 were the tip of the spear. They were not there to drop bombs, they were there to protect the fleet. Their mission was Combat Air Patrol, QAP. They were to orbit at the northern edge of the exercise area, watching the south for any reaction from the Libyan Air Force. They expected a reaction. Intelligence reports indicated that Gaddafi was eager to blood his air force. He had spent billions of oil dollars purchasing advanced Soviet weaponry. His airfields were stocked with MiG-23s, MiG-25 Foxbats, and French-built Mirages. He had imported hundreds of Soviet advisors to maintain the jets and train his pilots. The airspace over the Gulf of Sidra was about to become a laboratory for a direct confrontation between Western and Eastern military technology. To understand the violence that followed, one must understand the machines involved. This was not a battle between equals, it was a clash between 2 fundamentally different design philosophies. The Americans were flying the Grumman F-14A Tomcat. In 1981, the Tomcat was the most complex, expensive, and capable interceptor in the world. It was born out of the failure of the F-111B program and the desperate need to defend the fleet against Soviet bomber regiments armed with long-range cruise missiles. The F-14 was a beast. It measured 62 feet long with a wingspan that could shift from 64 feet to 38 feet in mid-flight. This variable geometry wing was its defining feature. At low speeds, the wings swept forward, providing massive lift and allowing the heavy jet to turn tightly in a dogfight. At high speeds, the wings swept back automatically, turning the aircraft into a delta-wing dart capable of Mach 2.34. But the F-14 had an Achilles heel. Its engines, the Pratt & Whitney TF-30 engines, were notorious. They were underpowered for the size of the airframe and prone to compressor stalls. If a pilot maneuvered too aggressively at high angles of attack, the airflow into the engine could be disrupted, causing the engine to cough, lose power, or flame out entirely. This meant that F-14 pilots had to fly with a delicate touch, managing their throttle settings carefully even in the heat of combat. However, the Tomcat's real weapon was not its engines or its wings. It was the Hughes AWG-9 weapons control system. This was a radar and computer complex so advanced that it comprised nearly 20% of the aircraft's total cost. Unlike Soviet radars of the era, which were like flashlights that illuminated only what was directly in front of them, the AWG-9 was a floodlight. It used pulse Doppler technology to filter out the clutter of the ocean waves, allowing it to see low-flying targets from more than 100 miles away. It could track 24 targets simultaneously and guide 6 AIM-54 Phoenix missiles to 6 different targets at once. It was a system designed to fight World War III. Against this technological marvel, the Libyans launched the Sukhoi Su-22 fitter. The Su-22 was a stark contrast. It was an export version of the Soviet Su-17. Like the Tomcat, it had variable geometry wings, but that was where the similarities ended. The Su-22 was a rugged, single-engine attack aircraft. It was designed to fly low and fast, delivering unguided bombs and rockets to battlefield targets. It was not an air superiority fighter. The cockpit of the Su-22 was cramped and had poor visibility. The rear view was blocked by a massive spine running down the fuselage, meaning the pilot was blind to anything behind him. Its radar was rudimentary, lacking the range and the processing power to track multiple targets. Its maneuvering systems were hydraulic and heavy. To fly the Su-22 was to wrestle with it. Why did Libya send attack aircraft to intercept the world's premier naval fighter? The answer lies in the rigidity of Soviet-style doctrine. The Libyan Air Force, guided by their Soviet advisors, believed in numbers and aggression over nuance. The Su-22s were available, they were armed, and they were fast. In the mind of the Libyan command, an armed jet was an armed jet. They did not appreciate the subtle, invisible disparity in avionics that made the F-14 a predator and the Su-22 prey. The 2 Su-22s that launched from Gordabia Air Base that morning were armed with AA-2 Atoll missiles. The AA-2 was a reverse-engineered copy of the American AIM-9B Sidewinder, a technology that was nearly 2 decades old. It was a rear aspect-only heat-seeking missile. This meant it could only track the hot exhaust plume of a jet engine. It could not see a target from the front or the side. To kill an F-14 with an AA-2, the Libyan pilot would have to maneuver behind the American jet, a nearly impossible task given the Tomcat's superior turn rate. As the Libyan jets climbed through 20,000 feet and turned north, they were flying blind relative to their opponents. They relied entirely on ground control intercept, GCI, controllers in a bunker, to tell them where the Americans were. The Americans, meanwhile, were watching the Libyans on the massive radar scopes of the E-2C Hawkeye circling overhead. The trap was set before the Libyans even left Libyan airspace. Commander Henry "Hank" Kleeman, call sign Fast Eagle 102, checked his displays, he was the squadron skipper. In his back seat was Lieutenant David Venlet, his RIO. On his wing, flying Fast Eagle 107, was Lieutenant Lawrence Muszynski, with Lieutenant James Anderson in the back. The time was 07:15 local. The sun was fully up. The sea below was a brilliant, shimmering blue. "Contact," Venlet announced over the intercom. "2 bogies, nose on, range 20 miles. The AWG-9 radar had picked them up instantly. On Venlet's Tactical Information Display, TID, a round green CRT screen in the rear cockpit, 2 symbols appeared. They were closing fast. The combined closure rate was approaching 1,000 knots. Kleeman ordered a maneuver to test the Libyans' intent. The F-14's initiated a offset. They turned slightly away from the approaching contacts. If the Libyans were just patrolling, they would continue on their original course. If they turned to match the F-14's, it meant they were attempting an intercept. The radar blips on Venlet's screen shifted. The Libyans turned. They were mirroring the American move. "They're turning with us," Kleeman said. The tension in the cockpit ratcheted up. This was not a drill. The rules of engagement, ROE, authorized by President Reagan, were specific but restrictive. The American pilots could not fire unless they were fired upon or unless the enemy demonstrated hostile intent. Turning to intercept was hostile, but was it hostile enough to shoot? Not yet. Kleeman decided to force the issue. He brought the flight back around, setting up a head-on pass. The 2 formations were now flying directly at each other like jousting knights. This was a game of chicken played at supersonic speeds. The distance collapsed. 10 miles, 8 miles, 5 miles. At 5 miles, the silhouettes of the Su-22s became visible. They were sleek, needle-nosed aircraft with their wings swept back for speed. They were closing at nearly 15 miles per minute. Inside the Libyan lead aircraft, the pilot was under immense pressure. His GCI controller was shouting vectors. He could see the large, grey shapes of the American fighters growing in his windscreen. He knew he was outclassed. Perhaps he panicked. Perhaps he was following a secret order from Gaddafi to create an international incident. At a range of roughly 1,000 feet, a distance covered in a fraction of a second at these speeds, the Libyan pilot pulled the trigger. A flash of fire erupted from the port wing of the lead Su-22. A white smoke trail streaked out ahead of the jet. "Brake left! Brake left!" Kleeman's voice cracked over the radio. He hauled the stick to the left and slammed the throttles to full military power. The F-14 responded instantly, its massive control surfaces biting into the air. The missile, an AA-2 Atoll, was doomed from the moment it launched. As previously noted, the AA-2 was a rear aspect missile. It needed to see the hot tailpipe of a jet. By firing it head-on at the F-14, the Libyan pilot, given the missile's seeker, had nothing to look at but the cold nose cone of the Tomcat and the empty blue sky. The seeker head swirled, confused, finding no heat source. The missile tracked straight for a moment, then drifted lazily downward, passing harmlessly between the 2 American fighters. The failure of the missile was technical, but the significance of the launch was political. The threshold had been crossed. The line of death had ignited. Fast Eagle 102, Tally 2, they fired. The rules of engagement were now satisfied. The Libyans had committed an act of war. The American pilots were now cleared to defend themselves with lethal force. Kleeman and Muszynski executed a textbook bracket maneuver. Kleeman broke hard left while Muszynski broke hard right. This forced the Libyan wingman into an impossible decision. He could not follow both targets. He hesitated, continuing straight for a moment too long. Kleeman reversed his turn. The F-14's wings swept forward automatically as the computer sensed the need for lift in the high G turn. The Tomcat, despite being nearly twice the weight of the Su-22, pivoted in the sky with surprising grace. The TF-30 engines roared, managing to hold the energy despite the violent maneuvering. Clemens slotted in behind the lead Libyan jet. The Su-22 pilot, realizing his mistake, tried to climb and turn hard to the right, exposing his belly. It was a fatal error. He had just presented a massive heat signature to Clemens' missile seekers. "Fox 2!" Clemens pulled the trigger on the stick. An AIM-9L Sidewinder hissed off the rail. The Lima model Sidewinder was a generation ahead of the missile the Libyan had just fired. It had a cooled seeker head that was incredibly sensitive. It didn't just need the tailpipe, it could track the friction heat of the airframe itself. It was agile, fast, and deadly. The missile covered the distance in seconds. It impacted the rear fuselage of the Su-22. A bright orange fireball engulfed the tail of the Libyan jet. The aircraft shuddered violently, then began a death spiral. The canopy blew off, and the ejection seat rocketed the pilot away from his disintegrating machine. Simultaneously, Music Muczynski had dealt with the wingman. The second Libyan pilot, seeing his leader burn, attempted a desperate split S maneuver, diving toward the ocean to gain speed and escape. It was a move that might have worked against an F-4 Phantom, but the F-14's radar had never lost lock. Anderson, the RIO in Fast Eagle 107, called out the parameters. "Shoot him! Shoot him!" Muczynski waited for the perfect tone. The Sidewinder growl in his headset rose to a high-pitched whine. "Fox 2!" The second missile launched. It tracked the diving Su-22 perfectly. It struck the tailpipe just as the Libyan was leveling off near the water. The explosion sheared off the entire empennage of the aircraft. The Su-22 cartwheeled across the surface of the Mediterranean, disintegrated into a shower of spray and debris. "Splash 2, 2 good shoots." The radio call marked the end of the engagement. From the moment the Libyan fired to the moment the second splash appeared on the water, less than 45 seconds had elapsed. It was a total victory. But more importantly, it was a revelation. For decades, the West had feared the numerical superiority of the Soviet bloc. They feared the swarms of cheap, rugged fighters. But over the Gulf of Sidra, the F-14 had demonstrated that in the modern age, technology and information management were the decisive factors. The Libyans had been flying a 1960s war. The Americans were fighting a 1980s war. However, the story did not end there. The humiliation of 1981 would fester in Tripoli and Moscow. The engineers would study the radar tapes, they would build new missiles, they would import better jets. 8 years later, they would try again. And the next time, they would bring a weapon designed specifically to kill the F-14. To understand why the engagement in 1981 was so lopsided, and why the subsequent engagement in 1989 would follow a similarly lethal trajectory, one must look beyond the courage of the pilots. One must examine the machine itself, not as an airplane, but as an information processing system. The F-14 Tomcat was not merely a collection of aluminum, titanium, and hydraulic fluid. It was a flying battleship designed to project information dominance over hundreds of miles of airspace. The heart of the F-14 was not the pilot sitting in the front seat. It was the man sitting behind him, the Radar Intercept Officer, or RIO. In the Soviet doctrine of the early 1980s, a two-seat fighter was generally considered a compromise, often relegated to the role of a trainer. The Soviet philosophy glorified the single pilot, the knight of the air, who flew, navigated, managed the radar, and fired the weapons all by himself. A second crewman was viewed as dead weight, a penalty to the aircraft's thrust-to-weight ratio. The United States Navy took a fundamentally different view. They realized as early as the 1960s that modern air warfare had become too complex for a single human brain to manage effectively. A pilot flying at Mach 1.5, pulling 6 Gs, managing fuel states, checking engine instruments, and physically wrestling the aircraft is operating at the absolute limit of cognitive saturation. To ask that same man to simultaneously stare at a radar screen, interpret complex electromagnetic data, manage radio communications with the carrier, and build a three-dimensional mental map of the battle space is a recipe for failure. The RIO was the solution to this cognitive bottleneck. He had no flight controls. He could not steer the jet. His entire world was the rear instrument panel, dominated by the circular scope of the Hughes AWG-9 weapons control system and the Square Tactical Information Display, TID, while the pilot focused on energy management, keeping the plane fast and pointed in the right direction. The RIO focused on battlefield management. The tool at the RIO's fingertips, the Hughes AWG-9, was the most powerful radar ever installed in a fighter jet. To understand the shock the Soviets felt when analyzing the Sidra engagements, one must understand the limitations of radar in that era. Most fighter radars of the late 1970s were pulse radars. They worked like a flashlight in a dark room. You pointed the beam and you saw a reflection. However, if you pointed that beam down toward the earth or the ocean, the reflection was blinding. The ground clutter, the radar energy bouncing off waves or terrain, would obscure any aircraft flying low. A low-flying fighter could hide in this electronic noise, invisible to the enemy above. The AWG-9 was different. It utilized pulse Doppler technology. It did not just listen for a reflection, it listened for a shift in frequency. It used the Doppler effect, the same physical principle that makes a passing ambulance siren change pitch to filter out the background. The ocean waves moved at one speed, a fighter jet moved at another. The AWG-9's computer could mathematically subtract the ocean from the picture, leaving only the moving target. This gave the F-14 a revolutionary look-down, shoot-down capability. It could see a cruise missile or a fighter jet skimming the waves from more than 100 miles away, regardless of the clutter. But the true superpower of the system was a mode called Track While Scan, TWS. A traditional Soviet radar had to stop searching to lock on to a target. It focused its beam like a spotlight, updating the position of that single enemy rapidly. However, this left the hunting aircraft blind to everything else in the sky. It was akin to looking at the world through a straw. The AWG-9 did not have to stare. Its computer was powerful enough to store the track files of 24 separate targets simultaneously. The radar dish would sweep the sky, hit a target, update its position in the computer's memory, and keep sweeping. The RIO did not watch a raw, fuzzy radar sweep that faded with every rotation. He watched the tactical information display, a clean, synthetic, digital map. Symbols represented enemies, friendlies, and unknowns. The computer prioritized them, calculating which target was the most dangerous and offering a firing solution for up to 6 simultaneous launches. In the Gulf of Sidra, this technological disparity created a slaughter. While the Libyan pilots were listening to ground controllers shouting vectors over static-filled radios, struggling to spot the Tomcats on their primitive, clutter-filled scopes, the American RIOs were playing three-dimensional chess. They knew exactly where the enemy was, how fast they were going, and exactly when they would be in range. The Libyans were fighting a war of reflexes. The Americans were fighting a war of processed information. The loss of 2 Su-22s in 1981 was a humiliation for Colonel Gaddafi, but it was a quiet crisis for the Soviet Union. The wreckage of the Libyan jets on the floor of the Mediterranean represented a catastrophic failure of Soviet export hardware and, more critically, Soviet aerial doctrine. The Soviet model of air defense was rigid and centralized. It relied heavily on ground control intercept, GCI. The logic was sound in theory. A massive, powerful radar station on the ground could see farther and clearer than a small radar in the nose of a jet. Therefore, the battle should be managed from a bunker. The pilot was viewed as an executor, a limb of the central brain. He was told what heading to fly, what altitude to maintain, and when to arm his weapons. This doctrine worked reasonably well against slow-moving bombers or in predictable large-scale scenarios. But against the dynamic, fluid violence of tactical fighter combat, the loop was too slow. In the 45 seconds it took for the Tomcats to bracket and destroy the fitters, the ground controllers in Libya barely had time to process the fact that the merge had occurred. By the time they could issue a command to brake or fire, their pilots were already floating in parachutes. Soviet advisors stationed in Tripoli and intelligence analysts in Moscow pored over the data from the engagement. Initially, the reaction was denial. Reports were filed blaming the incompetence of the Libyan pilots. They argued that the Su-22 was an attack aircraft, not a dogfighter, and therefore the loss proved nothing about the capabilities of frontline Soviet fighters like the MiG-23 or MiG-25. But the technical experts knew better. They analyzed the radar tapes recorded by Libyan monitoring stations. They saw how the Americans had maneuvered. They realized that the F-14's had maintained situational awareness throughout the entire fight. The Tomcats never lost track of the enemy even while maneuvering at high Gs. The Soviet radars, by contrast, had narrow fields of view. Every time a Soviet-trained pilot turned hard, his radar dish would point into empty space, breaking the lock. To reacquire the target took precious seconds that the Americans used to calculate a kill solution. The realization began to dawn on the Soviet military-industrial complex. The gap wasn't just in engines or aerodynamics. The gap was in avionics and philosophy. The West was moving toward distributed cognition, sharing the workload between pilot, RIO, and computer. The East was still relying on the singular heroic pilot and the centralized ground control. Unless this changed, the skies of the next war would be a slaughterhouse. This fear would eventually drive the development of the MiG-31 Foxhound and Su-27 flanker, aircraft designed to mimic the F-14's capabilities, but in 1981 those solutions were years away. History, it seems, requires repetition for a lesson to truly sink in. For 8 years following the 1981 incident, tensions simmered. Gaddafi continued to fund terrorism across Europe and the Middle East. The United States continued to apply military and economic pressure. The line of death remained a point of lethal friction. By January 1989, the Libyan Air Force had upgraded its capabilities. They were no longer relying solely on the clunky Su-22 fitters. They had acquired fleet numbers of the MiG-23 Flogger. The MiG-23 was a significant step up in capability. Like the Tomcat, it was a variable geometry fighter. It was fast, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2.3. It carried the R-23-R-24 medium-range radar-guided missiles, weapons that could theoretically challenge the American Sparrow missiles in a beyond-visual-range duel. The Libyan pilots had also trained. They had internalized the harsh lessons of 1981. Their Soviet advisors had drilled a new aggression into them. They were told, do not be passive, do not let the Americans dictate the merge, be aggressive, use your speed, fire first. On the morning of January 4, 1989, the USS John F. Kennedy, CV-67, was sailing in the Mediterranean south of Crete. 2 F-14's from VF-32, the Swordsman, were on patrol. Their call signs were Gypsy 202 and Gypsy 207. Once again, the Libyan radars lit up. 2 MiG-23s launched from Al Bumba airfield and headed north. The setup seemed eerily familiar to the 1981 incident, but the American crews noticed a difference immediately. As the F-14s turned away to signal that they were not aggressive, a maneuver called a jink, the MiGs turned to match them. The Tomcats turned left, the MiGs turned to match. The Tomcats turned right, the MiGs turned to match. The Tomcats descended, the MiGs descended. This was not a coincidence. This was a calculated intercept. The The Libyan pilots were using their ground controllers to vector them perfectly into a nose-on collision course. They were hunting. The American RIOs, Lieutenant Commander Leo Enright in Gypsy 207 and Lieutenant Stephen Collins in Gypsy 202, recognized the hostile intent immediately. The geometry was collapsing fast. The closure rate was immense, approaching 1,500 miles per hour combined. Gypsy 207, load 'em up. The order to arm weapons was given. The master arm switches in the F-14 cockpits were flipped on. This time, the engagement would be different. The Americans tried to fire the AIM-7 Sparrow missile at long range. The Sparrow was a radar-guided weapon designed to kill from miles away, avoiding the dangerous furball of a dogfight. Fox 1. The first missile failed. The rocket motor did not ignite. The heavy missile dropped from the fuselage like a stone and fell into the sea. Fox 1. The second missile fired but failed to track. The guidance system malfunctioned. The technology was glitching. The invincible American system was cracking under the friction of reality. The distance was closing. 10 miles, 8 miles, 6 miles. The Libyan MiG-23s were now within visual range. They were barreling in, preparing to fire their AA-7 Apex missiles. The American advantage of long-range weaponry had evaporated due to hardware failure. They were now in a knife fight, exactly where the Libyans wanted them. But the training held. The two F-14s executed a split maneuver. Gypsy 202 broke high, Gypsy 207 broke low. The Libyan lead pilot made the fatal error of tunnel vision. He fixated on the lead Tomcat, ignoring the wingman. He lost situational awareness. Fox 1. A third Sparrow missile roared off the rail of Gypsy 207. This one tracked. It rode the radar beam generated by the AWG-9. It slammed into the lead MiG-23. The warhead detonated, vaporizing the cockpit and the forward fuselage. The burning wreckage tumbled into the sea. The Libyan wingman, seeing his leader disintegrate, panicked. He broke hard to the right, attempting to flee, but in doing so, he turned his tailpipe directly toward the second Tomcat. Fox 2. An AIM-9 Sidewinder launched. It sought the heat. It found the engine nozzle. The rear of the MiG-23 exploded. Once again, 2 chutes opened. Once again, 2 Soviet-built fighters were destroyed. The duration of the combat from the first hostile turn to the final splash on the water, less than 1 minute. The second defeat in 1989 sealed the verdict. The F-14 Tomcat had proven that it was not just a plane, but a dominant system. But the legacy of the Gulf of Sidra goes far beyond the tally of 4 shot-down MiGs. These 45-second skirmishes were the crucible of modern air warfare. They proved that the era of the dogfight, the romantic notion of knights of the air circling each other, relying on eyesight and stick and rudder skills, was dying. In its place, the era of the systems manager had arrived. The victory did not go to the aircraft with the biggest engine or the tightest turning radius. It went to the aircraft that could process information the fastest. The American crews won because they knew where the enemy was, they knew what the enemy was doing, and they could communicate that intent between the pilot and the REO instantly. They operated inside the enemy's decision cycle. The concept of the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, was formalized by military strategist John Boyd, but it was physically enacted over Sidra. The American loop, powered by the AWG-9 radar and the 2-man crew, was tight and fast. The Libyan loop, burdened by GCI lag and poor situational awareness, was slow and broken. By the time the Libyans had observed and oriented, the Americans had already acted. The Soviet Union watched these battles with a cold dread. They realized that their reliance on ground control and heavy blind aircraft was a dead end. This realization spurred a massive technological effort in the East. It drove the development of the MiG-31 Foxhound, the first Soviet interceptor with a phased array radar capable of tracking multiple targets. essentially a Soviet copy of the F-14's capability. It drove the design of the Su-27 flanker, a machine built to have the agility to survive the merge if the missiles failed. But the West did not stand still. The lessons of the REO and the track-while-scan radar evolved. Today, the F-14 is retired, a museum piece resting on decks of museum carriers and in boneyards in Arizona. But its DNA is in every modern fighter. The F-22 Raptor and the F-35 Lightning II are the ultimate expressions of the Gulf of Sidra lesson. The F-35 is a single-seat jet. There is no REO in the back. But the REO has not disappeared. It has been digitized. The F-35 software fuses data from radar, infrared sensors, and data links from other aircraft and ships. It presents this fused picture to the pilot on a helmet-mounted display that allows him to see through the floor of his own cockpit. The pilot is no longer just flying, he is managing a network of information that stretches for hundreds of miles. The Gulf of Sidra proved that in the unforgiving arena of aerial combat, information is the most lethal weapon of all. When the geometry collapses and the closure rate hits Mach 2, the survivor is not the one who flies the fastest. The survivor is the one who sees the truth. In the span of 45 seconds, twice in a decade, the sky over the Mediterranean taught the world a lesson that stands to this day. You cannot fight what you cannot process. And if you are reacting to the enemy, you are already dead. The ghosts of the Gulf of Sidra are not the pilots who ejected, they are the outdated doctrines that sank with their aircraft, victims of a new age of warfare where the microchip is as deadly as the missile. War is often decided by systems, but it is fought by men. And while the F-14 Tomcat protected its crews in the skies over the Mediterranean, it could not protect them from the cruel ironies of peace and routine operations. Commander Henry "Hank" Kleeman, the pilot of Fast Eagle 102 and the hero of the 1981 engagement, did not die in combat. He did not die in a glorious fireball fighting the Soviets. On December 3, 1985, 4 years after his victory, Kleeman was taxiing an FA-18 Hornet at NAS Miramar. It was a rainy morning. His aircraft hydroplaned on the wet concrete, slid off the runway, and overturned. The man who had defeated the Libyan Air Force and mastered the most complex fighter in the world was killed in a low-speed traffic accident on the ground. His RIO, David Venlet, went on to become a vice admiral overseeing the F-35 program, the very aircraft that embodies the lessons learned in that cockpit in 1981. On the Libyan side, the fate of the pilots remained shrouded in the secrecy of Gaddafi's regime. However, intelligence reports suggest that the pilots who ejected in 1981 were not treated as heroes. In the totalitarian logic of the Jamahiriya, getting shot down was often viewed as incompetence or disloyalty. They vanished into the anonymity of history, footnotes in a lesson they survived but could not explain. The aircraft themselves tell a story. Fast Eagle 102, the F-14 that scored the first kill, is preserved today at the Commemorative Air Force Museum in Texas. It sits silent, a relic of a time when the line of death was the most dangerous place on Earth. A critical question haunts the analysis of the 1989 engagement. Why did the highly advanced American missiles fail so frequently before the final kills? In the 1989 dogfight, the F-14's fired 2 AIM-7 Sparrow missiles that failed completely. The AIM-7M was a radar-guided missile costing tens of thousands of dollars per unit. It was supposed to be the standoff weapon, allowing kills from 20 miles away. The failure was not in the radar, the AWG-9, but in the hardware of the missiles themselves. Motor failure. The first missile simply dropped. The solid rocket motor failed to ignite. This highlights a persistent reality of air combat. Munitions are mechanical devices that sit on hardpoints, vibrating, freezing, and heating up for months. Even with rigorous maintenance, the failure rate of air-to-air missiles in the 1980s was shockingly high, often estimated at nearly 50% in real-world conditions. Guidance. Failure? The second missile tracked, but missed. This was likely due to the extreme closing speed. The combined speed of the F-14's and MiG-23's was nearly Mach 2.5. At that speed, the angular change, line of sight rate, is incredibly high. If the target maneuvers even slightly, the missile may not have the kinetic energy to pull the G's required to intercept. The success of the AEM-9 Sidewinder and the third, AEM-7 Sparrow, proved the value of redundancy. The American philosophy of carrying mixed loadouts, radar missiles for long range, heat seekers for close range, and firing in sequence saved the pilots' lives. If they had relied on a single magic bullet, the outcome might have been 2 dead American crews. As we look back at the Gulf of Sidra from the 21st century, we see the death of an era. For 70 years, from the canvas biplanes of World War I to the Phantoms of Vietnam, aerial warfare was defined by the dogfight. It was a visual arena. You had to see the enemy to kill him. You had to turn with him. It was visceral, athletic, and chaotic. The F-14 Tomcat and the AWG-9 radar killed that era by proving that a computer could track and target enemies that the pilot could not see, and by proving that information processing was more lethal than maneuverability. They ushered in the age of beyond visual range, BVR, warfare. Today, air combat is rarely about turning and burning. It is about stealth, sensor fusion, and long-range shots taken from 50 miles away. The pilots of the future will likely never see the enemy aircraft with their naked eyes until they watch the gun camera footage in the debriefing room. The ghosts of Sidra, the smoke trails of the Su-22s and the MiG-23s, were the last gasps of the old way of war. They tried to drag the Americans into a knife fight, only to realize the Americans had brought a sniper rifle.